Good morning. Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. A special thank you to Amanda Friedemann for inviting me today and giving me the opportunity to fulfill my legacy of Holocaust remembrance. My name is Doris Lazarus, and I am the proud daughter of two Holocaust survivors, Leah and Oscar Mozak. My beloved parents were born and raised in small cities in Poland, Ciechanów and Płońsk. They fought so hard for their lives during the Holocaust. Their survival meant life for me, a life of being loved and cherished and cared for. I have never known hunger or cold or fear. I truly was their reason for living, and they told me this every single day. They poured all of their dreams into me, wanting me to have the life that they never had. They arrived in this country alone and penniless, yet started a new life, raising a family filled with all of the Yiddishkeit and Jewish traditions that were almost extinguished. Everything I do in their honor. Before I tell you about my amazing trip to Austria, I do have a preamble to this story, which actually gives me another opportunity to highlight the incredible efforts of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's researchers. Growing up, my mother often told me the tragic story of the murder of her relatives, Uncle Aaron, his daughter Rivka, and Uncle Binyamin. But I had very few details and never imagined that any records existed. In the summer of 2018, I took advantage of the U.S. Museum's office to meet one-on-one with a researcher in their Highland Park office. I provided the researcher, Dr. Diane Affumato, with Uncle Aaron's name. Several months later, I received a 75-page document in German that detailed the arrest, conviction, torture, and execution of my three relatives. This is the only photo of them that exists. I learned that Uncle Aaron had been deported to the ghetto in 1941. He was ill and desperate for medical help. He removed his yellow star and escaped from the ghetto in the middle of the night. He returned to Ciechanów, his hometown. His daughter Rivka and brother Binyamin were still hiding in the city. Someone witnessed their reunion and reported them to the Gestapo. They were interrogated and tortured. The Gestapo accused them, and I quote, of subversive behavior, saying that the accused prisoners were lying and cynical during their interrogation and had to be handled accordingly, end quote. I think we all know what that really means. The SS said that, and I quote, in order to not be recognized as members of the Jewish race on the run, they concealed the Jewish identification mark according to their innate cunning, end quote. The Gestapo had a doctor examine them to see if they were fit for slave labor. The doctor's findings did clear them for deportation to a concentration camp, but then the Gestapo decided to escalate their punishment. So by order of Adolf Eichmann, whose name appears on the bottom of this document, and I quote, the Jews, Aaron, Binyamin, and 4 others in front of their people are to be hanged. Rivka is to be shot, end quote. Their execution took place on April 27th, 1942. Rivka was 22 years old. There is a duality that takes place when searching for records. We want to learn, but we're so afraid of what we will find. In spite of the painful, chilling words included in these 75 pages, I now have historical documentation as well as a death date for my relatives. I can now light a Yortzeit candle for them. Because of the dedicated researchers at the U.S. Museum, they can now be remembered and their story will be preserved. Here you see a grave marker. My mother promised herself that if she survived Birkenau, she would find the place where her family members had been murdered. She did find their remains 3 years later, their hands still tied behind their back. She applied for a permit to bury them, but the mayor of the city would only allow her one grave. So you see, my family members are buried along with the 4 others who were hanged that day. In the records, I discovered that Aaron Gilbert was actually my uncle's Machatunum, in-laws. I actually tracked down his grandson who lives in Mexico City. His name is also Aaron Gilbert. I shared all of these records with him. He was beyond stunned, but grateful to have them. We now have a very close relationship connected by this common family history. As I reflect on my recent trip to Austria, I am filled with gratitude. Retracing the path of my parents' final experiences during and after the Holocaust was a life-changing experience for me. The success of this journey would not have been possible without the dedicated, warm, kind, and talented efforts of Joellen Decker, a researcher at the U.S. Museum. Because of her devotion to my mission, I was able to literally walk in my parents' footsteps. The endless support and attention I received will never be forgotten. Some of you listening may already have had success in reconstructing your family history. We share and celebrate each other's victories. For those of you who have not yet explored or have tried without success, I hope my story will inspire you to never stop searching. In August of 2019, my husband and I planned a trip to Austria. Although I had been to Poland to research my parents' experiences during the Holocaust, I knew very little about their lives after they were evacuated on the death march. My mother did talk about that brutal death march in January of 1942, how the Nazis forced them to run, not walk, through miles of ice and snow. The temperature between 20 and 33 degrees below zero, the coldest winter ever recorded in Polish history. They were brutally mistreated, whipped by guards and attacked by dogs. As I say these words, I can't help but realize that this was day 29 of her death march, 76 years ago. She was then taken to Ravensbruck and Neustadt before she was finally liberated. My father's journey, I knew very little about. He rarely spoke about the Holocaust. Clearly haunted by his experiences, he kept his memories to himself. Some processed trauma with words, others with secrets and silence. This is not uncommon in survivors' homes. It's done to protect the children. Therefore, it was up to me to reconstruct the history. I knew that my mother returned to her hometown after liberation, but it wasn't safe. The murder of the Jewish people did not end with the Holocaust. The hardships and danger continued. My mother eventually made her way to the free zone in Austria, mostly on foot. She was put into a DP camp in a hotel called the Golden Cross in a town called Bad Ischl. It was here that she met my father, Oscar Mozak. He was so alone. His first wife, Perla, his son, and his daughter were all murdered upon arrival in Auschwitz. In preparation for our trip, I began researching the Golden Cross Hotel in Bad Ischl, but could not find any information at all. It was at the suggestion of Kelly Zaney, our Director of Education, that I contact and pursue this with the U.S. Museum researchers. As I mentioned earlier, destiny led me to Joellen Decker, the research and reference librarian in the museum's Holocaust Survivor and Victim Research Center. Every connection I made on this trip, every detailed document I discovered would not have been possible without the efforts of Kelly and Joellen. A child of survivors is always on a quest for knowledge. Our lives are like a puzzle, but with many missing pieces. Jo Ellen provided me with pieces I thought were lost forever. Much of this story is about a bracelet, a hotel, and a wedding. This is my parents' wedding photo taken in Bad Ischl. No guests, no gown, no flowers, not unusual for a post-war wedding. This is a map of Austria. Bad Ischl is located in what is known as Upper Austria, high in the Austrian Alps, known as the Salzkammergut region, meaning rich in salt, Bad meaning bath. Bad Ischl became a spa town in the first half of the 19th century. This is my arrival in Bad Ischl. As you can see, it's a beautiful spa town located on a river surrounded by mountains. It is also home of the Habsburg dynasty's summer residence. The Habsburgs were the ruling family of Austria for almost 600 years. I also learned that we were in Nazi country. 80% of Eichmann's staff was from this region. Hitler's eagle's nest, used by Hitler and members of the Nazi Party for social and government meetings, were also right in this area. And Lake Toplitz, just outside of Bad Ischl, is known for its connection to Operation Bernhardt, the largest counterfeiting operation in history, set up by the Nazis in 1942, where prisoners in Sachsenhausen were forced to make engraving plates and produce British money. If you saw the movie Counterfeiters or watched a 60-minute segment in 2000, you are familiar with this history. This was the Michigan Avenue of Bad Ischl. And yes, men in the town wore lederhosen and women looked like they had just stepped off the set of The Sound of Music. Our first meal, we couldn't read the menu and no one spoke English. We took a chance and ended up with a lentil dish with a huge matzo ball on top. Comfort food just when we needed it. On the left is the hotel Shift where we stayed. And on the right, the hotel as it appeared in March of 1938 during the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany. We walked onto the main street, the very same street where the citizens of Bad Ischl welcomed the Nazi with Heil Hitler salutes, flowers, and great enthusiasm. You see swastika banners and townspeople holding signs. We thank our Führer. Our first meeting was with Brigitte Schmidt. Her family had owned the hotel, which became the DP camp. She still is the current owner. She wrote a book about the Golden Cross and presented me with a copy. She then went on to tell me that she had family members who had been Nazis, saying this with neither pride nor shame. This first document that she showed me from the book was from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. It states that this was the first DP camp established on December 16, 1945. It shows the address of the hotel and a statement and says that there was electricity and running water, but no gas. Her book states that there were approximately 80 survivors in total, with 4 to 5 sharing a room. She claimed the hotel was taken from her family, although the UNRWA documents show that her family was compensated. I told her that the nearby camps were the last to be liberated and that there was obviously a shortage of beds in the region. The survivors desperately needed housing. And she said, maybe yes, maybe no. On the right, you see a picture of the hotel then and now. She then showed me this picture and told me how the hotel's furniture had been mistreated. I looked at the picture and immediately understood that the survivors had no gas, no heat, and that they had chopped up the furniture and burned it for warmth. She informed me that it was Niedermeyer furniture, a very expensive designer at the time. I then said that these survivors had been freezing for 6 years and that they needed some warmth. Again, she said, maybe yes, maybe no. I quickly understood that we were coming from very different perspectives and that I needed to be respectful and non-judgmental. It wasn't easy. We had very different narratives, but we each carry our own narratives based on upbringing, attitudes, identities, and culture. On the right, she shared a document showing that a Maccabi sports team existed in the DP camp. This warmed my heart to imagine young men and boys finally belonging again, being part of a team, playing sports in the fresh air, a return to life. This is a picture of the Milk Riot. In August of 1947, a dairy shortage hit Vienna. Therefore, the US authorities ordered that the rest of the population would temporarily receive powdered milk. The local population blamed the Jewish DPs who, under the protection of the Allies, continued to receive fresh milk. 5 members of the Communist Party and a well-known Nazi organized a demonstration. Hundreds of angry, violent townspeople surrounded the hotel. With screams, fist shaking, and wild abuse, the crowd surrounded the hotel, shouting, "Beat the Jews to death. Hang the dirty Jews. We want to see Jewish blood." I was shattered reading this. My heart broke for my parents. After surviving 6 years of the Holocaust, they had finally found shelter. They were struggling to rebuild their lives, believing that life could start again. And now they are again facing threats, terror, and hatred. And remember, this is happening 2 years after the Holocaust. Following this violent episode, for the safety of the survivors, the DP camp in the Golden Cross was closed. They were homeless again. I'm still trying to research where they went until their emigration to the US 1 year later. Here is the trial of those charged. The military court sentenced those responsible to up to 15 years of imprisonment for inciting racial hatred. After countless protests and the advocacy of Austrian politicians on behalf of the convicts, the Americans reduced the sentences to 1 year, but it's doubtful that any time at all was served. This is our meeting with Mayor Hans. He invited us for Viennese treats, followed by a walk in the town to see well-known people who had spent time in Bad Ischl. As you see on this plaque, Theodor Herzl spent summers here, the last one just prior to the meeting of the First Zionist Congress to take place in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. Other notables were Mark Twain and the German composer from Vienna, Brahms. The mayor presented me with a book about the history of Bad Ischl and showed remorse for what he called the dark history. He said it was an honor to be in the presence of those who have a sincere interest in remembering the Holocaust. Wolfgang, his director of cultural affairs, presented me with a beautifully bound folder. Inside, 3 priceless documents: my parents' permit to marry, intent to marry, and their marriage license. My mother met my father in the Golden Cross DP camp. She knew him for only 2 weeks when he proposed, saying, "I'm alone, you're alone. Do you want to be alone together?" My mother said yes, yes to a future, yes to dreams, to possibilities. My father had nothing, no money to buy her an engagement ring. So he sold a bit of his scarce provisions on the black market, some sugar or cocoa, and he bought her a bracelet. As Wolfgang listened to this story, his eyes filled with tears, and he said, "The bracelet finds its way home." And here's my mother's bracelet. The first document, the intent to marry, shows my father's mandatory obligation to report any prior marriage. He says, "I, Usher Mozak, give this information under oath. I was married to a Perla Krinsky, born August 15th, 1910, since January 22nd, 1932. My aforementioned spouse, Perla Krinsky, was incinerated in the crematorium of Auschwitz Concentration Camp on December 17, 1942. I now have Perla's birth date and death date, allowing me to light a yahrzeit candle for her. Who else will? It was heart-wrenching to learn she was just 32 years old when she was murdered with my half-siblings, Hirsch and Miriam, age 4 and 8. What a short life they had. The next document is the permit to marry. As foreigners, they were required to produce identification papers. Here, my father states, "I cannot get evidence from our former home state because we do not want to return to Poland for the sake of a marriage certificate. It is not safe. It is our wish to emigrate to America." This is the actual marriage license. My father was a tailor and my mother a seamstress, but here I learned he was a Meister Schneider, a master tailor. I also learned for the first time the date of their marriage, September 16th, 1946, as well as my paternal grandmother's maiden name. And on the left, this made me cry, my father's signature, so recognizable because he was a lefty. My mother's signature, using the name Lonia, a Polish name she took after liberation, too afraid to be called Leia again. It is so hard to explain the power and the value of a piece of paper. Here I am standing in front of City Hall with Wolfgang, and then on the right, in the very same spot as my mother, almost 75 years later. This is a picture of my father that I often looked at. He's in the center. I really never noticed anything in the background. I asked Wolfgang if he could identify the location of where this picture had been taken. He got very excited and told me the photo was taken right in front of a famous fountain in Kaiser Villa Park, the summer residence of the Habsburg family, just a few short blocks away. He told me surely the DP camp survivors would have spent time in this beautiful park. I walked the same path to the park that my parents would have walked on to take this photo 75 years later in the same spot. This is another Wolfgang, Dr. Wolfgang Quatember, the executive director of Ebensee. He is providing me with documents that trace my father's journey from the death march to Mauthausen, then to Ebensee, then to Wells II, and then back to Ebensee again. Ebensee was a subcamp of Mauthausen, where prisoners were forced to build tunnels for armaments. This was one of the most diabolical concentration camps ever built. It was controlled by a deranged commandant who starved and beat the prisoners mercilessly. The prisoners were forced to work in freezing tunnels with very little or no protection. Without shoes, many stood in freezing water all day and died of hypothermia. The death toll was so high that although Ebensee had a crematorium, the bodies were sent to Mauthausen to be burned. On May 5th, all of the prisoners were ordered to assemble in Tunnel B. The commandant addressed them in the following way, I quote, "Meine Herren, dear sirs or gentlemen, it is for your shelter to enter the tunnel now, because we, the SS, will defend this camp against US forces. I want you all to come home to your families," end quote. The prisoners began to think that a final murder would happen. They had never been addressed as sirs. They resisted and refused. This saved their lives. The next day, on May 6th, the American army arrived to liberate them. This is a picture of a memorial ceremony. Wolfgang explained this photo was taken in Ebensee. I never knew what the words on the sign, Julius Meinl, meant, but found out that Julius Meinl is a well-known coffee shop based in Vienna. There are currently 2 in Chicago, one on Southport and one on Montrose. This is another photo of a memorial service in Ebensee. Again, I never noticed that in the center was a veiled monument. In this picture, my father is on the left, looking over, still wearing his striped jacket from Auschwitz, although it is a year after liberation and others are in civilian clothing. I wish I could ask him why. On the right, you see the unveiled monument in the center. In this photo, you see again the monument and another memorial service. On the right, the director takes us to the Ebensee Memorial grounds to see the monument as it is today. It states, "In blessed memory to our brothers tortured and murdered here, from the Jewish Committee of Bad Ischl." This is a photo of my father's striped jacket from Auschwitz. It is so tiny. It looks like it could fit a child. I donated it to the US Museum in 1992, knowing that the museum would give this artifact a voice. In 2009, after our museum opened here in Skokie, my father's jacket was brought here on temporary loan and was part of our permanent exhibition for 6 months. Here, another plaque to the 8,000 murdered in Ebensee and a picture of the original gate to Ebensee. You can see the KZ on the gate, which stands for concentration lager. I couldn't help and asked about the family living right outside of these gates. 2-car garage, toys in the driveway. They are facing what is now a graveyard full of ashes. I thought perhaps they wanted to teach their young children about hatred in our world, but was told that they often complain about the traffic and visitors to this memorial site. Our travels continued to the Judenplatz in Vienna. We visited a nameless library. Built in 2000, this is the memorial for the Austrian victims of the Holocaust. This memorial was made possible by the efforts of Simon Wiesenthal. The endless copies stand for the vast number of victims and represent the people of the book. The spines are backwards, the titles and contents unknown, hidden. The double doors are locked with no doorknobs or handles. Doors suggest coming and going, a simple freedom, but these doors do not open. On the right, we find the Stolpersteins, brass stumbling blocks which list the names and deportation dates of Nazi victims. Here on the left, we found a listing for Hashomer Hatzair, and on the right, 2 words in Hebrew, Chazak ve'ematz. Hashomer Hatzair holds so much meaning for me, as my mother's strongest pre-war memories were of this Zionist group. She never could have known that it was here that she was learning the courage, bravery, and leadership skills she would later need to survive in the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Her childhood friend and member of Hashomer Hatzair is Rosa Robota. Rosa was the heroine of the Auschwitz uprising in October of 1944. She smuggled the gunpowder passed to her by the Sonderkommando. She was caught and tortured, but never gave up any names. The Nazis hanged her on January 6, 1945, less than 2 weeks before the liberating armies came in. Her last words were the motto of Hashomer Hatzair, Hazak ve'ematz, be strong, have courage. If you have visited the Illinois Holocaust Museum here in Skokie, Rosa's heroic story is part of our permanent exhibition. This is the Mauthausen camp. It held 200,000 prisoners from 1938 to 1945. Here, 39,000 Jewish prisoners were murdered. The camp held prisoners of all nationalities, Italian, Soviet, Czech, Yugoslavs. Here, Ron and I are with the executive directors. They take us to the grassy knoll that looks so peaceful today. Here they describe the stone quarry and what is known as the stairs of death. Starved and emaciated prisoners were forced to carry heavy cement blocks weighing double their body weight up 186 stone steps. If one fell, it caused a domino effect, and all fell to their death in the quarry. Many times after making it to the top, laughing, sadistic guards would push them to their death, or the guards would point a gun at a prisoner, giving him the choice to be shot or push the prisoner in front of him off the cliff. I shudder imagining my father here after everything he had already been through. Here we see the ovens and an invoice from Topf and Sons, the engineering company, stating, "You ordered crematorium. Here is the price for this type, with drawings and modified options." It's one thing to read and watch films, but seeing this irrefutable evidence was an indescribable feeling. We were so shocked to see graffiti inside the gas chamber. Scratched into the walls are the numbers 88. We were told H is the 8th letter of the alphabet, and 88, double H, represents Heil Hitler. This is a common symbol among white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. These are additional memorials to the Jewish and non-Jewish victims of Mauthausen. We visited the Jewish Museum in Budapest at the Doheny Synagogue, the largest in Europe and the second largest in the world. It is built right on Theodor Herzl's birthplace. On the grounds, there is a memorial to Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat from Budapest, who saved tens of thousands of Jewish lives by issuing certificates of protection. Also, a memorial for Nicholas Winton, the young British banker who saved 669 children during the Holocaust by sending them on kinder transports from Czechoslovakia to England. In a booth outside of the synagogue, I found a 91-year-old Auschwitz survivor. She reminded me so much of my mother of blessed memory, with the numbers on her arm, still sewing at age 91. This is Ron and I on the banks of the river Danube. You can see the Shoe on the Danube Memorial. In December of 1944 and January of 1945, the Nazis took 20,000 Jewish people from the Budapest ghetto to the Danube, men, women, and children. They were ordered to take off their shoes and shot at the edge of the water. They were shot in the back. When the Nazis did not want to waste bullets, they tied them together and shot the first person in the line. On our last night in Budapest, again, seeking comfort food, we find the traditional kurtuskaliks, or chimney cakes. In this group photo are others who have been to Badisho. Some of you may recognize our own Danny Spungen and his son, Sam Harris, President Emeritus of the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and his wife, Dee Dee. My mother, Leah, survived to delight in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The name Perla lives on. Upon my return, I thought a lot about the impact that this trip had on me. What I couldn't know was the impact that my trip had on others. I'd like to share some of the words from the letters that I received. From Brigitte, the owner of the Golden Cross Hotel. It is somehow life-shaping for me as well, in a way which I do not yet fully understand. Getting an insight into some lives of people like your parents who have spent such important phase in my family hotel does touch me deeply. It makes me grateful and even a bit proud, you know how I mean it, that our place provided new life for them, love, future, and hope. From Wolfgang, Director of Cultural Affairs. You transformed my historical interest and curiosity into empathy and warm sympathy, which I feel as a precious gift. It's all an enriching experience I will keep and save in my mind and in my heart. The whole thing is too intense, too dramatic, and too touching. From Rupert, the director of Mauthausen. As offsprings of the perpetrators, it is often difficult for us to mentally put ourselves in the position of the victims' families and how the Holocaust still affects their lives today, as we simply lack this experience. This is why I would like to thank you for sharing your experience with us. I personally see encounters like ours as a mutual learning process, which I am very thankful for. Mom, your legacy lives on. You used your voice to tell the world about the Holocaust, and you taught me to use mine. To my fellow descendants, we are the sons and daughters. We carried our parents' dreams, and now we carry their memories. I hope I have inspired you to never stop searching. You can connect the past to the present. You too can make history come alive again. Thank you. It's been a privilege. Join us here next Wednesday, February 24th, to hear second-generation speaker Ethan Benzinger share his family story of survival. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook page and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you all for your support during these extraordinary times. Stay safe.
Thanks, Doris. We have a couple questions if you're up for it.
Yes, please.
Okay, first one. What does it mean for you to have memorial sites that are available to the public?
Such as our museum. I am beyond grateful to have our museum and the other museums that are dedicated to preserving the history of the Holocaust. It is so important. This is our greatest tool, is to teach. Our museums are filled with artifacts. The artifacts are silent witnesses. They all have a story to tell. And having these institutions give voice to the artifacts. On a personal level, I'm so grateful to be involved. The museum gives me unlimited opportunities to teach and to learn from our many visitors.
You talked about the family that lived next door to the camps. What was it like for you to visit these places and see other people's reactions?
It was very, very hard for me to visit these places, as you can imagine, but then again, very grateful because I not only literally walked in my father's footsteps, but see that there are memorials to remember what happened. I was very curious to see neighborhoods built right around these memorial grounds and facing the graveyard. I was a bit shocked to learn, as I said, that the neighbors are not exactly comfortable or happy with the amount of visitors to these sites.
Who interpreted all those documents pertaining to your family members?
Great question. Well, I was very excited when I got the email from the US Museum, but not being able to open it, I sent it to my daughter and said, can you do me a favor, open this document and then email it to me? A few minutes later, she wrote back and said, Mom, there are 75 pages here. I was absolutely shocked. I began slowly reading them, finding enough familiar German words that told me this was the story of those three family members, Uncle Aaron, Uncle Benjamin, and Cousin Rivka. I could also tell that it described their death. I started using Google Translate, but it was very tedious. I came to the museum interns. They were very taken by my story, and they agreed to translate. It took them months. They did it. It was a team effort. They translated every word of it into English and gave it to me. It's a priceless gift.
That's wonderful. Was it hard to give your father's jacket to the U.S. Museum?
It was very hard to give up my father's jacket, especially when I signed the document stating that I was giving it up permanently. I grew up seeing my father's striped jacket in the closet, hanging with his other clothes. At that time, there were no options. There were no museums dedicated to the Holocaust. When I heard in 1992 that the US Museum was looking for artifacts, I decided to donate my father's jacket, knowing that I was giving it a home, knowing where it would be shared with the world, and understanding that it would be kept to the highest level of conservation and preservation standards. I go to DC. I try to go to DC about once a year, and every time I do, the curators at the US Museum are wonderful about giving me a private space to visit with my father's jacket. They give me gloves so I can touch it and hold it and connect with his history.
That's lovely. How did the U.S. Holocaust Museum make all these connections for you in Austria?
Another great question. So again, it started with Kelly Zaney, our beloved director of education, who directed me to the U.S. Museum. Once I contacted Jo Ellen, she told me to reach out to the Stadtamt, which is the local Bureau of Vital Statistics in Bad Ischl. That's when I started communicating with Wolfgang, who told me he would start searching for any documents pertaining to my parents' history. After communicating with Wolfgang, we then heard from the mayor of Bad Ischl, who kindly offered to meet with us as well. It was obviously the connection that I made to Wolfgang that prompted an email from Brigitte. I was in absolute shock when I received an email from her telling me that she heard I was trying to find any information about the DP camp. She said that her parents had owned the DP camp called the Golden Cross, and that she still owns the DP camp and offered to meet us there. The next connections were also made thanks to Kelly and Joellen, to the directors of Ebensee and Mauthausen. And it was with both those meetings that I actually saw the documents, the dates, and found the details of my father's experience from the time he was forced onto the death march in January of 1945 until his liberation on May 6th in Ebensee. Looking for records, researching is like finding tiny keys. And every door opens another door.
What else did you learn about the execution of your relatives?
Well, I found details about them. I found that Uncle Aaron was a banker, that Uncle Benjamin was, it said in German, Kaufmann, which means a salesman. Also that he ended up being the head of the Judenrat after their city became occupied and the ghettos were being formed. I found out that they were a very prominent and well-respected family. I learned that although the doctor had cleared them to be deported to a concentration camp for punishment, because they were well-respected and prominent, the Nazis wanted to make an example of them. They also wanted to instill fear in the population by showing examples of collective punishment. I learned that the executions took place not in Chechanov, their hometown, but in Nowy Dwór, and I pieced together a story about a bribe that took place, a bribe given to the Nazis to not hold the execution in their hometown, where children and spouses and family members were forced to watch the hangings. What I did not find out is why Rivka, my cousin, was not hanged, why the Nazis chose to shoot her. I don't know. I can only speculate, and sadly, there's no one left to ask.
When did you learn about your father's first family?
So, as I mentioned, my father did not speak about the Holocaust. He kept those memories to himself. I was 22 years old when he passed away. And it was just before he passed away that he told me I was actually part of his second family, that he had a first family. And that's all that he told me. I was haunted by this. I was haunted by the fact that I had siblings who were children who were murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. I didn't know their names. I didn't know their birth dates. It was as though they were ghosts, as though they never existed. So in 1998, I went on the US Holocaust Museum's first mission to Eastern Poland and to Auschwitz. I was able to meet with the director of Auschwitz at that time. We looked for records. I was not successful, but then I went to his hometown and went through those records in the magistrate's office. It was very difficult, but I was very blessed. I found the names of my half-brother and sister, Hirsch and Miriam. I found their birth dates and I found their death dates. And we know how important it is in Judaism to have those death dates so that I can light a Yortzeit candle for them every year. I also then submitted their names to every repository and institution so that their lives could be documented and their deaths remembered.
That's wonderful. One last question.
Yes.
After going on this trip and kind of retracing your father's footsteps, what do you want people to kind of take away from hearing this part of their story, your family story?
Well, I really hope that if any of you, any descendants, any spouses are looking for records, don't give up. It took me many years of research until I finally got lucky. And when you actually can find any documentation, any details, any history, it really is priceless. It's important for me. It's important for my descendants to have this. And it's also, once you find the records, it's also apparent that these are historical documents. So it's not only for my personal gain to have these records, but to see that this was recorded, that this is not a story that I'm telling. These are records that the Germans kept. So for me, finding these details, reconstructing the story, walking in their footsteps was all made possible by the wonderful researchers at our museum and at the US Museum. So I hope I've inspired you to never stop searching. This is how we remember them.
Thank you so much. That's all the questions I'm seeing. So I would let you say goodbye one last time.
Thank you, Sierra. This would not have happened without you. And thank you all for tuning in. It means more to me than words can say.